Hey there, you. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'll be sharing 7 quick ways for you to fix your failing book. Where are you going? Don't leave. So these are actually some small, easy ways that you can make your book more readable, engaging, and original. You ready? Tip number 1. Cut all the scenes where your characters are sitting and talking. Now, I might have lied earlier because depending on how far along you are in your writing career, it's possible that these scenes make up the majority of your book. My first book was 80% people sitting and talking. My second book was probably 65% people sitting and talking. And let me tell you, sitting and talking is boring. I don't know why it's so hard to realize that when you yourself are the one writing, but the moment you see another piece of media where all of the characters are literally just sitting and talking, you are bored out of your mind. Especially if the scenes are used to gain information. Like it's possible, hypothetically, to craft a tightly paced literary novel, constant tension and conflict showcased through dialogue. But even that would run the risk of boring your audience because nothing is happening. There's nothing for their other senses to focus on besides their ears listening to people speak. Even in the old classics like Pride and Prejudice, the characters are always taking a turn about the room. Or buying ribbon. Or being forced to play pianoforte by your cousin's wealthy benefactor despite your lackluster skills.
Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?
It's not just sitting and talking. Because when there is nothing to ground you in the scene. There's nothing for you to focus on, or that can add stakes or interest to the scene. Sitting and talking is always a problem, but this is especially true if your characters are sitting and talking in order to learn important things about their world, or their journey, or in order to include necessary exposition for the audience. We never want that to come in the form of the characters sitting and talking. If you're doing that, cut it out. Literally. Rewrite those scenes so that the characters have to work to gain the information somehow. It needs to be hard-won. There should be movement and choices involved. And not just your characters being like, okay, yeah, okay, interesting, yeah, I got it. Even if you change just this one thing, it will drastically improve your boring book and turn it into a more readable book. Tip number 2, cut all the planning scenes. Similarly to the previous tip, planning scenes are almost always unnecessary and repetitive. The audience does not want to be told what will happen, only to then see the characters do what they said they were going to do. Unless you're writing some slapstick heist story where your characters come up with some elaborate plan only for it to go horribly wrong at the very first step, so that the rest of the scene is not repeated information, then just cut it. You don't need the planning scenes. Cut out the planning and skip straight to the characters implementing their plan. The action involved. Movement. Change of scenery. Think of planning as a form of exposition. It needs to be dribbled into scenes in order for the scenes to make sense. But we don't want a massive chunk of text devoted to planning. You could also think of these planning scenes as a form of showing versus telling. We don't want to be told what's going to happen in the story and then shown. We just want to be shown. Tip number 3. Cut all of the scenes where your character is alone. Now you might be like, what? But there's a famous quote that for some reason I could not find when I was making this video, so I can't tell you who said it or what the quote says exactly. But it basically says, don't leave your character alone because then they will start thinking and musing. And no one wants to read an entire scene of musing, internal narration. Just like no one wants to read an entire scene of people sitting and talking. You need to rewrite your scenes where the character is just sitting and thinking into something with more tension and conflict. Obviously, your whole story can't be just one battle after another, and there should be moments where your character and your audience can absorb what is happening in order to process and experience the core emotions of your story. But you need to find a way to include those moments within other scenes. And not just have random spots in your story where your main character lays in bed for 10 pages thinking. That's, not amusing. Tip number 4. Do a search for what with a question mark. Cut that. I don't know if this is just me, but a major dialogue crutch of mine is what with a question mark. A character will say some new information or a defamatory comment, and then the other character will just be like, what? And it feels so natural when I'm writing the scenes, but then during edits, I realize that like 20% of my dialogue is just people saying what with a question mark. And it just slows down the whole scene, it slows down the whole story. There's rarely, if ever, a reason to jump to the other character during dialogue just to have them say what with a question mark. Either move the conversation on to the next important point, or just skip the pause altogether and let the first character finish their initial point. The what with a question mark just slows everything down and gets quite repetitive. especially when every character responds that way at least once in the book. That's a lot of what's, what's with a question mark, and do a search and find out. Tip number 5, on a similar topic of punctuation, do a search for exclamation points and cut them. Now, before you start throwing tomatoes, let's not misconstrue here. I am not one of those people that is totally anti-exclamation point. I actually love exclamation points. You should have seen me at my first job out of college. I was in charge of the weekly newsletter, and I would end every subheading with an exclamation point. Because I was excited, and I liked making the newspaper, and I wanted people to be excited when they were reading the newsletter. But then one day we got an email from a subscriber, and literally the entire purpose of the email was just to point out how many exclamation points were in the newsletter. They were saying it was unprofessional. So then the next time I was making the newsletter, I was all like, deleting exclamation points, having a very stoic, serious newsletter. So no, I love exclamation points. That is not what this is about. But in a novel, one way to tell if your dialogue needs work is by removing the exclamation points. And then, if the dialogue doesn't work anymore, without the assistance of the exclamation point, then you should probably rewrite it. You will end up with stronger, less melodramatic dialogue throughout your novel. Tip number 6. This is a painful one, but go through your novel and cut, or at least flag, every scene that feels overly familiar, as if you've seen it before in other stories. Even if you're adhering pretty closely to the standard genre expectations in your plot. For example, if you're writing a fantasy and you have scenes where the character enters the strange new world, and then scenes of them training with a mentor, and then scenes building up to a final battle, you can still infuse those scenes with originality. They need to be flagged if they feel overly familiar, because you really should. You should infuse those scenes with originality, so that they don't play out the way those scenes always play out. You just don't want all of your scenes to feel overly familiar. That will never create a memorable book. You want your readers to feel like you wrote this book, and not the person sitting next to you in writer school who just happened to get published first, and you were in there just like... no one wants that. No one wants to feel like they're reading like a subpar plagiarized version of someone else's book. Which brings me to tip number 7. Identify every setting in your book and add one obscure, specific detail. This is also something you should do for your character descriptions. So if you have a grand entrance hall that dazzles your characters, instead of describing it as having an arched golden ceiling with swirling vines carved into gilded wood and tiny colored tiles laid in an intricate pattern on the floor, try to describe less of the room in order to have more of an impact. Because readers can really get lost in all those adjectives until the image of the room in their mind is muddy and generic. There's an excellent quote by Neil Gaiman that says, "You can take for granted that people know more or less what a street, a shop, a beach, a sky, an oak tree look like. Tell them what makes this one different." So try to find one obscure, specific detail and let the rest of the room grow from that one detail in the reader's mind without you having to describe it. Let them build the room inside their own head. That will always be more memorable than you trying to describe every detail of the room. Okay, geez, now I know I have to think of an example. Oh my goodness, I'm not good at this off the top of my head. Alright, this isn't going to be any grand literature or anything, but just an idea about how you might go about this with that grand entrance hall would be to have your characters enter the grand entrance hall that's going to dazzle them, and say something like, "Gilt beams twinkled in the candlelight, and the desk clerk wore 2 large rubies in each of his ears." Okay, I really couldn't think of anything, but hopefully you get the idea here. Instead of describing big, try to describe small and specific. Okay, that paints the picture in your reader's mind. You don't need to describe the whole room, just one obscure, specific detail, and then let your reader fill out the rest of the room on their own, with their own imagination.